Hello, welcome to TSC Talks, the source cannabinoids. My name is Jill Woodworth, and I am your host. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My guest is Marc D. Lewis, neuroscientist. He's a recently retired full professor of developmental psychology at the University of Toronto from 1989 to 2010, and at Radboud University in the Netherlands from 2010 to 2016. He is the author or co-author of over 50 journal publications in psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience, editor of an academic book on developmental psychology, and co-author of a book for parents. He's written 2 books on the science and experience of addiction, which is kind of why I had him on the podcast, having gone through addiction treatment and it being a challenge in the past, dealing with addiction-related issues related to substances. I thought he'd be an excellent guest for the TSC community, the cannabinoid community, because his approach is really eclectic and a lot of harm reduction infused. He is the person that came up with the concept that addiction is not a disease. His book, Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, has stirred controversy among people with addictions, their families, addiction resources, and treatment providers. He also wrote in 2011 Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, blending his life story. He talks about his own struggles with addiction with a user-friendly account on how drugs affect the brain and how alterations in brain function help explain addiction. So I heard him many years ago when I was in recovery programs, and his blog, which is memoirsofanAddictedBrain.com, is just fantastic. He gives his own snippets from his own experience related to his clientele, and he has guest bloggers come on and talk about their own perspectives and their experiences dealing with addiction in all different, I don't want to say parameters, perspectives, not to lean on that word too much, but he offers a lot of perspectives, shifting, no judgment, just a lot of support offered in this blog. But reading the comments, and I've posted there myself when there's a topic that I feel like I need to speak on, and he handles the comments, and sometimes they get a little heated with just a lot of patience, grace, support, non-judgment. He's one of the gang. That's kind of the vibe I got from Marc. He's not here to say, hey, I know all this, even though he's pretty incredible and got quite a body of work. He's met the Dalai Lama. He's had a debate with Nora Volkoff, who is the head of NIDA, and he's just willing to jump right in and not defend, but explain his work and his research and his work on the ground with the people, and that is kind of where he has led to really put this out there that addiction is not a disease. It's multi-causal, different for everyone, and no one size fits all in terms of what's right for treatment and recovery. Having my own struggles with more traditional methods, his book and his blog was a blessed relief. So I hope that you guys get something from this. I know there's a lot of people in TSC communities and that end up in dealing with addiction. Of course, why not? I mean, we're hit on all kinds of levels with stressors beyond compare in many ways. So he really lets the heat off and gives you some support and validation as you may be struggling or struggled in the past. So I hope that this is helpful. And anyways, I'm going to stop talking because I'm here for him to talk. Thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for more. We have got an incredible product that we're going to be launching soon called Mic Drops. Working with Mike Robinson, cannabis formulator, to bring a product to market. We actually stopped working on our other product, which was a sobriety agent to help facilitate sobriety based on hemp extracts, but Mike wanted to put that aside and pick up this product, which will soothe, relax, refresh during this stressful coronavirus lockdown. They are bath drops and they're unbelievable. So we're going to be doing also a 1,000,000 milligram giveaway of CBD. Stay tuned for more information on that. You can look at our website, tsctalks.com. And that's where information will be posted about this for the time being. I'm going to stop talking. And if you have any questions, want to reach out to me, be on the podcast, have thoughts, concerns, want to make a contribution, go to our website, hit our PayPal button, email us, pjlacey6@gmail.com. Hit me up on Facebook, Messenger, wherever you can find us. Thanks again, and take it away, Marc. I'm going to play it out with a little music, and then you'll be hearing Marc. Thanks, Marc, for coming on the podcast. I followed your blog for quite some time, Understanding Addiction, and you've written 2 books, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain and The Biology of Desire. Both fascinating. I'm in the middle of the second one. And I think what, drew me was your personal connection and interaction on your blog and comments with people that are in the midst, just dealing with a wide range of viewpoints, very respectfully. So yeah, thanks for being on. So yeah, just tell me about your life a little bit.
And just to clarify, that blog is all about, people who are struggling with addiction or who have struggled or are coming out the other side. Those are most of my readers. Well, I guess the most formative experience in my youth was being sent to a boarding school when I was 15. It was a very negative experience. I hated it there. It was very militaristic. And when I came out of there, I was already playing around with drugs. So we moved to California. At that point, I was almost 18. And started taking all kinds of drugs, and drugs became a way of life for me. Mm-hmm. And that was okay in Berkeley, California in the late 60s, but then that moved on for me to playing with opiates and getting psychologically addicted to opiates quite a lot. And that lasted for years across different contexts and different continents, which kind of ended up when I was back in Canada and going to university and taking morphine for the labs and so forth, and having a really hard time quitting entirely. Got into grad school and then got convicted for stealing drugs from a pharmacy, and then got kicked out of grad school, went back to square one, became a house painter, window washer, anything I could find, got back into mental health slowly but surely, quit drugs finally around age 30, and finally got back into grad school in psychology. And from then on, it was pretty much a clean run. I did really well and decided I'd like to be a professor, and felt like I had, from going from a place of intense insecurity to a place of recognizing that I had some skills and I could do this. And then I got a job at the University of Toronto as a professor, went up the ranks to full professor, and studied child development, especially emotional development and personality development. And at the end of all that, I kind of came around to addiction again, this time as a scientist, and studied I did a lot of neuroscience for the last 10 years of my stint in Toronto, looking at brains of kids who had emotional difficulties mostly. And got into studying addiction by looking at the neuroscience of addiction, looking at what goes on in the brain when people become addicted to drugs, to alcohol, to addictive behaviors, gambling, porn, sex.
How did you conduct those studies? How was that done?
You mean the neuroscience stuff with kids?
Yeah.
We use dense array EEG, 128 channel EEG. So you get a very precise temporal signal of what's going on in the cortex, but you also get some spatial localization. It's rough. It's not as fine as MRI, but it's together. You put together a picture of, really, you can look at changes and patterns over time. And that's what I was interested in. Before and after treatment, for example, or just changes in cortical function with development for kids with different levels of anxiety or aggression. And that was what we did mostly. And then once I was back in addiction, once I got into addiction in that way, I gradually got out of academia. I became an addiction writer, speaker, did lots of speaking gigs around the world and stuff. I've had this quite active blog now for, 8 years or something. And I finally retired from academia, and which was kind of a pleasure and a relief after all those years.
I bet.
And now I just do, I do what I do. I see clients now. I do psychotherapy online with people with addiction problems. And I still do a lot of writing, and I don't have to teach, and I don't have to do research anymore. I've had enough of that. So that's where I'm at now.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing the personal connection over the years. I was going to say that you were still able to like struggle through your addiction and get into college, and it didn't compromise your life completely. It was a progression, I assume.
Yeah, it was. I mean, for a while, I was really messed up, doing a lot of stealing drugs and stuff, and I was a mess. But, worked my way through it. And after that, I kind of quit on my own with the help of mindfulness meditation and stuff.
Okay.
And then I got into therapy and spent quite a few years really examining the parts of myself that were, shall we say, were satisfied by the addictive impulse, and sometimes satisfied, sometimes not satisfied, but what drove me in those directions.
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I found interesting in your work is your, I don't want to say discovery, but the addiction is not a disease. And that's a cornerstone of more traditional medicine's understanding and treatment. And I think that, did you research that in your work, like you were just talking about? Can you talk about how you researching that? And
Yeah, well, at that point, I knew a fair bit of cognitive neuroscience and emotional processes in the brain, but I didn't study directly people in addiction, people addicts who had, I didn't look at them specifically, but I read a whole lot of the research and put it together and modeled it and tried to develop some theory based on those findings. And as you say, the conventional medical approach was, yes, addiction is a brain disease and it's incurable and it's chronic. And if you have an addiction, then you have to have medical treatment and doctors should be on the front line. And none of it seemed right. It didn't seem right from a neural perspective, and it didn't seem right from a practical service perspective either. Mm-hmm. From the brain perspective, it was like the main argument was, hey, we look at the brains of addicts and there's differences. They've changed. There's changes in their brain, so they must have a disease. And then I began to put two and two together, and brains are always changing. And whenever people have intense emotional experiences, especially repetitive experiences driven by desire, by strong emotions, when you fall in love, when you get married, when you have kids, even psychotherapy changes the brain in measurable ways. So it didn't surprise me that there were brain changes that could be attributed to addiction as well. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, okay, that's learning. I get it. That's learning in the reward system. And so the whole disease model began to say, okay, what exactly is the benefit of calling that a disease? Like, do you catch it from toilet seats or
right?
Where's that going? And then, I began to realize slowly that the whole disease nomenclature, the whole definition of calling addiction a disease, had to do not with the science of it, but rather as an alternative to seeing addicts as nasty, brutish, self-indulgent, creatures, which was kind of the status quo up until the 80s or 90s. Mm-hmm. So people at NIDA, for example, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and Nora Volkow was the head of that for many years, said, well, no, they're not bad people. They just have a brain disease. So they were actually trying to help. Uh-huh. Try to take away the blame. And for me, it's like, well, I didn't ever think that they were just self-indulgent losers anyway. I thought that they're people with problems that are like other people with problems, trying to resolve them in ways that are not always that effective. So thank you for trying, but that doesn't really help because disease produces another stigma.
Right.
And that stigma it's really a heavy weight to carry, to think of yourself as having a chronic disease. You're never going to get better. And the AA track, you give over your life to a higher power, which kind of implies that you don't have the power to make the changes that you need to make. And a lot of people were not being benefited by this definition, this way of thinking about addiction at all. So I began to realize that other people, I wasn't the only one, there were other people in the addiction field who also saw addiction not as a medical issue, not as a brain disease, but rather as a social issue that had to do with trying to deal with trauma, difficulties in development, having come through childhood experiences of emotional or physical or sexual abuse and neglect and other nasty experiences. For me, it was boarding school. That was pretty awful. And the correlations were intense, that the more people who had been through traumatic or difficult childhood or periods in their adolescence had a much higher chance of becoming drug addicts in adulthood. So, okay, that's what's going on. It's not a disease. It's a way of trying to cope. And it's obviously a way that often doesn't work very well. But people try to do what they can with the resources that they have available.
Right. So surviving on a certain level, self-medicating, and
Right. Exactly.
yeah. And I think AA, I started in that program, and at the beginning it was really helpful, just because waking up and realizing that you've kind of trashed your life, or whatever the common thread was.
Yeah.
And having people that you can talk to, that you can relate to, and you have a group when everything else has fallen away.
Yeah.
Was helpful, but it's just the all or nothing mentality of it, I struggled with. And I think that seems to correlate with the disease model in the way, in not to get political, but just the germ theory, the black and white nature of traditional medicine, and we're human beings.
Give it a label, have a diagnosis. That way you can, throw drugs at it. Unfortunately, there are not very many drugs that help people in addiction. I mean, that's another story. We can get into that later if you want.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. AA has some good things going for it. The whole fellowship aspect is terrific, but it's very dogmatic. It is, as we say, very black and white. And for many people, that's just deal breaker, I guess.
Yeah, it's just not, I didn't feel like it was a level playing field. I felt like my lived experience was a lot different from, somebody that had been, we're just so different as human beings. And, we're extrapolating these methods or these sayings and everything. And I, as a female, I think that there was a power imbalance at times. And, I just didn't feel like I wanted to buy it. I did. I really tried. And when I started to question, I think it was scary for my family, because I was a mess.
Yeah, really.
And, it helped me. Finally, something broke through, and it's affordable. And I think that kind of leads to my next question is what is the general treatment now for addiction, and what is it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, as you know, there's the addiction treatment industry, the rehab industry is a mess. It's just a tremendous mess. I guess at one extreme, probably the worst extreme, there are rehabs that do very little for people that charge vast amounts of money. I mean, anywhere up to, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 a month. And then, some of them have kind of the trappings of a resort and very nice places to be for a month, but then you go home to your lonely little apartment in downtown, whatever, and it's really hard to stay off drugs or booze. So people relapse all the time. The relapse rate is huge. So you're really paying a lot of money for very little. And that's cornered the market for a long time. Also, these treatment centers are mostly 12-step oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a fair bit of research that suggests that 12-step methods have a lot of problems. The success rates are not fabulous. As you yourself point out, people just don't find them. I mean, some people are helped, definitely. There's a percentage, could be anywhere from 8% to 15, 20%. There's different measures do get helped. But for a lot of people, it's not the answer. So what else is there? Well, there's AA. And of course, as you say, that's affordable because it costs nothing.
Right.
It's grassroots. I mean, there's community based, and that's terrific. And some groups seem to work better for some people than others. And as you say, women sometimes are suffering with a particular kind of, sexism that appears in these groups, a kind of patriarchal culture. So there's that, and there's the other problems, and there's the fact that even if you've used or had a drink after several months or even years of sobriety, you have to start again at the beginning, and there's a lot of shame.
That's hard for people, the shame. I think
remorse.
I felt like, oh my gosh, I relapsed and on cannabis, on marijuana, which is a whole nother story, but because it was like I was taking a bunch of other meds, and I went into like a whole trip, but kind of like this hierarchy of, the people that haven't ever relapsed, and we're defining this. It just opens up a lot of questions, for me personally, and frustrations.
Yeah. I mean, and what else is there? Well, there are, individual psychotherapy can be very helpful. Mindfulness meditation can be very helpful. There's all kinds of forms of psychotherapy that are particularly useful for people in addiction, like motivational interviewing and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy is another one. That's really useful for people in addiction. I've learned something about that myself. I find it very helpful in my psychotherapy practice. And internal family systems therapy was something that I'm actually studying right now, which is a very, very useful way to look at the different parts of a person that sometimes are in conflict with each other. So there's lots out there, but usually that means having to go and see a psychologist and having to pay for it often, unless it's insured, which, usually it's not insured fully or for a very long time. So other than that, you're kind of screwed. I mean, and most people in addiction, statistics show us that most people actually do quit without professional help, without treatment. And that's something that many people are surprised by. It seems counterintuitive, but in fact, people burn out, burn through the addiction. They grow out of it and they say, okay, I can't keep doing this. And they find the resources to change their habits. And that's the majority, actually. So yeah, that's good to know.
It is. My boyfriend partner is one of those people that, he in college and just heavy drinker, and just kind of told me at one point, he was just like, this is really stupid. And he's really smart, and he was able to just kind of logically work his way out of there. And, I found I wasn't able to talk myself that way, but it just speaks to the fact that we're all wired so very differently and we're just, and personalized medicine to me seems like it's going to be needed more and more. However, getting to that point will be interesting.
Well, we agree.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's going to be of great benefit to people with addictions as well as people with other kinds of problems.
Yeah. So how with coronavirus, and, I wanted to ask you about your methods for working with people. Do you just draw from lots of different tools, I'd say that? And I wanted to ask you about the medication type harm reduction topic.
Yeah, well, I got my Ph.D. in psychology, and it was partly a clinical degree, so I learned how to work with people. I was trained in psychodynamic method, psychoanalytic, they used to call it. Not the very old-fashioned Freudian style, but rather a more updated version. Mm-hmm. That's what I learned initially. But then in later life, when I've come back to doing therapy with people, I've really borrowed a lot from other forms of therapy. As I say, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy is one, and internal family systems is another. I've become more and more focused on the issue of the voices that we have in our head, the messages that we tell ourselves. I think have a huge amount to do with our tendency to be depressed or anxious or self-contemptuous, self-shaming, and those are powerful features that accompany addiction, as many of us know. They get you into it in the first place, and they get exacerbated by the addiction itself. Because, people who are taking drugs, substances, or doing other things in this habitual, compulsive way are not pleased with themselves. Self-contempt gets worse rather than better. And so these internal messages, I think, are just a critical part of treatment. Learn to focus in on them. Don't just be the victim of them, but also recognize the part of you that's giving you that message and ask that part, find out, what is the problem? Why do you have to be so angry at me? You're saying that to yourself, right? And then often you follow it back into childhood and you start to recognize where those messages came from originally. They're not necessarily copies of the way your parents spoke to you. Rather, they may be ways that you learn to speak to yourself in order to avoid parental admonishment or other negative experiences in childhood, or maybe just to have friends or whatever you needed to do to keep yourself under control. Often gets out of hand and turns into a pretty nasty internal, forum in there of conflicting messages and voices.
Oh, so I can so relate to that. Yes,
yeah, I think that's just a crucial approach. And
yeah, those. I think that you just hit on something and helped me a little bit. Yeah, I think I've always struggled with that kind of internal dialogue. I think it's something that I've just learned to accept and talk back. I don't think it's going to go away. I think I just have to talk it back and think, oh, that's not really what's happening. And I've so deeply internalized some, parental tenets that, sometimes I think, and maybe this is true, it's hard to separate your voice in your head from the actual person, obviously. Yeah. So, and, perceive that person through the lens of this voice that you've internalized, and stepping out of that. I think for someone dealing with ongoing trauma, and I think that's something that with the condition that I'm just going to tie this into the podcast a little bit, people dealing with a chronic condition where a child is having, or an adult is having, serious medical seizures or whatnot, frequently and unexpectedly puts you in a real heightened state, like hyperarousal.
Yeah.
So I think that this community is so at risk, not just, first of all, the children that are, being in the middle of these traumas and on medications and whatnot, and then the repercussions into the family. And it's just weighed heavy on my heart because I know how much that tied in with my own issues and addiction and was just so hard. So I think you're, not to segue, but you're talking about the voices in the head. And, I was just thinking, I have a lot of voices of concern for my children from the past that, need to be rooted out. What an important piece of progressing and processing.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I mean, sometimes they are almost direct copies of parental messages. I remember banging my head against the wall when I was like 12 or something and saying, I have to stop and think before I act or before I speak. I don't think my parents ever said that exactly, but I had to say that to myself a lot. And that turned into a pretty bitter kind of internal critic. So that didn't help me much when I was in boarding school and having to deal with all kinds of shit from my social environment.
I bet, boarding school, how old were you?
I was 15, so I was old enough to, have some kind of stability in my life, but it was far from home. It's 1,000 miles away from where I lived, and I couldn't understand why they sent me there. They didn't send my brother there, so, what's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a nice place. Kids were mean, they were bullying, they were anti-Semitic, they were just nasty. So I just had to learn to survive in a whole different ecosystem.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge life-shaping lesson right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, talking about alternative ways of treatment, and what are your thoughts on, psych meds? And harm reduction is a term that's tossed around, and I liked that because, I use medical cannabis, and that's been really, really useful. And I stopped, that was kind of why I dropped out of AA, because I just was not working. I felt guilty and I felt ashamed, even though I felt better.
Yeah. It's hard to carry that around. There's no need for it. It's really simple, actually. People take drugs and drink for the simple reason that it makes them feel better. It gives them some control over their emotional state, over their mood. And if you have issues of anxiety or depression, which many of us do, then it's really nice to be able to take something that makes you feel better. One of the main problems for drug addicts, I would say the main problem, is that they have to struggle to such an extent to get drugs. And for alcoholics, well, the struggle isn't necessarily to get the booze, but the struggle is the stigma and shame and scolding that comes along with it, that comes from yourself and from other people. If people are allowed to take mood enhancing substances without all the crap that goes with it, they will often just moderate themselves, modify, and if it's a harmful drug, or if it's a drug that does have some kind of negative side effects, they will very often just grow out of it, just stop, as I mentioned before. So it isn't necessary to cause addicts this extra hurdle of having to deal with the shame, the stigma, and the unavailability. Well, opiates are an obvious example. Well, opiates are antidepressants.
Right. And, I think I latched onto something in one of your articles about, and I went to a link where there's like opiates, that, functional people that use opiates every day or functional heroin addicts.
Yeah, many.
And they have to live with this horrible, probably cloud and, I think that we've villainized these substances when, I totally agree.
Totally. But if you're lucky enough to be living in, Portugal or Switzerland or Germany or certain other European countries, and you're a heroin addict, then you can probably get your heroin based on a medical prescription of supervised use, and you know what you're getting, you know what the dose is. And what these experiments in drug use have taught us is that people will tend to quit when they're ready if the chaos in their life is reduced. Well, there's nothing more chaotic than having to go down to the damn street corner to score.
Right.
not knowing what you're getting, not knowing if you're going to overdose, and the violence and the criminality and all that that goes with it. So anyway, and people say, well, yeah, maybe opiates make you feel better. I mean, just like benzodiazepines or antidepressants, but they're addictive. Yeah, so are all those other drugs.
Right.
Antidepressants are addictive. Benzos are addictive. Drugs very often produce a focus, a concentration, sometimes a physical dependency as your system gets used to them. And yes, that is a negative side effect, adverse effect. But that doesn't make it wrong. You have to weigh the benefits against the costs. And for people who are in acute emotional distress, the benefits may just outweigh the cost for some period of time. So help them get through that. Don't punish them more than they are already being punished by their circumstances. And then give them the kind of support that they need to eventually slow down, stop, or go to controlled use.
That's great. Yeah.
And basically, and in a nutshell, in answer to your question, that's harm reduction. That's the principle of harm reduction. Reduce the chaos, reduce the turmoil, reduce the stress in the life of people who take drugs, and allow them the opportunity to get off drugs or to reduce their dependence on drugs on their own because they can, because life isn't so awful anymore.
Right. Let that rat park study, I read it a while back where they did all the rat studies and, they're in these like really desolate rat parks. And then you add in some life and some,
they're isolated to a cage, a steel cage. And then they find that they are definitely happy to have some morphine to ingest. But when they're put into a park-like environment where they can play with other rats and have toys and have, wood shavings and things that rats like to hang out with, they actually stop. They give up the morphine.
Yeah. I think I have to share that, my drug of choice was alcohol. And a couple of months ago, I was at a function and I was very adamant. I mentioned that I, didn't drink, but it was just people ignored it. And finally, I was like, what, I'm just going to have a little drink. I don't see the problem with that. Mm-hmm. And I did, and nothing happened. Of course, I was nervous about it, but it didn't like throw me back into old patterns and whatnot, because my life and my situation and my own. Yeah. So
I hear that all the time.
Do you?
On my blog, there's been a recent discussion about that. I mean, these discussions come up again and again.
Yeah.
Of course, some people have a hard time and going to controlled use after they've been severely addicted, and probably they can't,
Right.
Controlled use isn't for everybody, but for a lot of people, after they've changed their circumstances and changed their relationship to the substance, they can be social drinkers now and then. It's roughly 50%, according to the stats that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Yeah. I think to me, being able to have a drink and not freak out personally was a triumph in a lot of ways, and not to go home and think about it, I think that it's the thought about it, and it's that way of thinking that it's or the
I do know.
Yeah. Coronavirus, how has that been for you personally and your work? I assume you still are doing consultations and. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of lucky because my psychotherapy practice is almost entirely online.
That's so cool. Was that like a progression or?
My family moved to the Netherlands. We're Canadians, but we moved to the Netherlands 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I had people who wanted to see me for treatment all over the world. So there was no other way than to do it online. And I just got used to it. It works very well. It's not a problem. I mean, just like you and I are having a conversation here, it's a fully articulated way to connect with somebody. I mean, yeah, it's not quite, there's something a little bit different about it, but it's just not a big problem. In fact, it might make things easier.
Definitely.
So now, with the virus, I mean, yeah, so I'm still at home, still online, and still seeing my clients, and just not getting out of the house much. I should probably try to get out more, but I hear that from a lot of people too, that they tend to become homebodies because of the lockdown. So,
yeah, I was just thinking like, it would be nice to go out, but it's going to be hard when we go back to less restrictive restrictions, because I've kind of gotten like hunkered down. I don't know. There's like this, like you're nested or you're just, it's like a snow day, an eternal snow day. Like there's this whole fear climate, I guess, for people that are struggling with, addiction, active addiction, and it's got to be tough.
I think so too.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on, what someone, just someone could do, or?
What often goes together with addiction is a kind of narrowing of the social world. You get your needs for soothing and satisfaction or pleasure from a substance. You don't need to connect as much. So the social world kind of shrinks around you. And before long, you kind of lose the opportunity to, you lose the availability of other people. You lose friends, you lose family, you kind of, bury yourself in a little hole in the ground where you have your substance and you have maybe a couple of other people around you that also are involved in substances, and that's it. So the coronavirus also is pushing us to burrow into a shrinking environment. We're sitting there at home by ourselves, and people are just losing even more the opportunity to connect outside of themselves, to extend their social web, and to extend the availability of getting your needs met by other people and other activities. So that in itself, I think, is a just built-in hardship of this lockdown phase that we're in. And secondly, I think a lot of people are just stressed because it's scary, because this is a horrible disease, because people are dying. And for other people, or the same people, their kids are at home now. They're not at school. So they have to wear several hats, do their jobs, but also take care of their kids, and the kids might be running up wild.
Yeah, my son walked in just a few minutes ago. I was like,
yeah. How old is he?
He is 18. Yeah, he's got some, and I think that's one thing that's kind of aggravating for me is, he's on an IEP, or he's got a lot of special needs support, and that's just like gone.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty serious problem right there.
I think that it'll take time. They've started to put into place the online network and whatnot, but we're talking about kids that need help just reading the material, and you've got a parent who's not trained. Anyways, that's a whole nother subject, but yeah, it's tough.
It is tough. It's tough to have all these needs and more needs piled on top of them, and stress, and what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to my job, and what's going to happen to my kids. And stress pushes us more towards our substances. I mean, so that's definitely a big part of what's happening.
Yeah, I see a lot of people embracing, having a drink. And, I'm not judging in any way. If that's your method of coping and it hasn't caused you damage, then go ahead. But it's concerning a little bit, I think, going forward.
You mean drinking online, drinking?
Well, just like, like having a drink on your Zoom meeting with your friends or whatnot. I see
think that's a big improvement over drinking alone.
Yeah.
If you're going to drink, by all means, make it social so that you don't close those doors. Probably going to drink less and less often because you don't feel like, you're this little lonely, pathetic creature all by yourself and all you got is your bottle of booze. So I actually think that's a nice adaptation for people who can keep it under control. I think it's great.
To wrap this up, what would your recommendations be for people that are struggling? I think we've
just try to go wide, stay connected, just really stay connected.
Stay connected.
To other people, to the outdoors, to beauty, to nature, if you can. Don't let all those connections just shrivel up so that you're in this little cave, lonely cave with your bottle or with whatever it is that you use. Recognize that it's not a terrible thing to drink or use a little bit more during a period of crisis. It doesn't have to last forever. It may be a way to cope. Don't give yourself a huge ton of additional on top of it, because that doesn't help. So
good point. Yeah, I think I liked what you said about in one of your articles about addiction being part of being human, not as something that's bad.
Yeah.
In a sense.
It's very common. People go into it and come out of it.
Right. And our society kind of promotes it. We need it now, more. You have this, I want that, that kind of thing.
Yes, that's part of it too, where we live.
Yep. Where can we find you? What your site is, Understanding Addiction.
If you Google my name, Marc Lewis plus addiction, you will find me for sure. And by my website, my blog, my books, and all kinds of YouTube stuff. I've got a YouTube channel now with videos of my talks and interviews all kind of organized there. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your work. Love your blog.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Okay,
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, check out our website, tsctalks.com. Stay tuned for more information on mic drops. And take care, stay safe, love ya. Please consider making a contribution to the work of this podcast, our outreach, our platform at tsctalks.com. Hit our PayPal button and help us out.